Half-Breed by Maria Campbell, Chapter 1. In the 1860s, Saskatchewan was part of what was then called the Northwest Territories, and was a land free of towns, barbed wire fences, and farmhouses. The half-breeds came here from Ontario and Manitoba to escape the prejudice and hate that comes with the opening of a new land. The fear of the half-breeds that their rights would not be respected by the Canadian government when it acquired the land from the Hudson's Bay Company, along with the prejudice of the white Protestant settlers, led to the Red River Rebellion of 1869. Louis Riel established a provisional government at Fort Garry, Manitoba, but escaped to the United States in 1870 when troops arrived from eastern Canada. So with their leaders and their lands gone, the half-breeds fled to the areas south of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and established the settlements of Duck Lake, Batoche, St. Louis, and St. Laurent. There was no government in Saskatchewan at this time, and no law and order, so they formed their own, fashioned after their way of life, the order and discipline of the Great Buffalo Hunts. They elected Gabriel Dumont as their president, and with him 8 councillors. They set up laws by which the people could live peaceably, and penalties if the laws were broken. They made it clear that they weren't opposed to the Canadian government, and would abandon their council as soon as the territories acquired a true government and was able to establish law and order. Here for a few years they lived happily, but the 1870s and 1880s brought the settlers and the railroad, and just as has happened in Ontario and Manitoba, their way of life was again threatened. They were squatters with no title to the land they lived on. They wanted assurance from Ottawa of their rights to keep the land before the incoming white settlers encroached on them by using homestead laws. Our people believed the Lands Acts discriminated against them, stating that they had to live on the land and wait 3 years before filing a claim. They had lived on the lands for years before the Lands Acts and had ever been thought of, and didn't believe they should be treated like newcomers. They sent many petitions and resolutions to Ottawa, but again, as in Ontario and Manitoba, Ottawa was not interested and continued to ignore their existence. Finally, in 1884, they decided to ask the only man who could help them. Gabriel Dumont and 3 of his councillors rode to Montana to see Louis Riel, who was living in exile. Riel returned with them to Saskatchewan to discover that it was not only half-breeds who had reasons to complain, but white settlers and Indians as well. Because of pressing demands in the East, Macdonald's conservative government had cut federal monies going to the territories. This left the Indians without the rations and farming assistance promised to them under the treaties. The white settlers had suffered one disaster after another, including 3 years of drought. This, together with their dissatisfaction over the Lands Claims Acts, had completely soured them against the federal government. This time petitions and resolutions went to Ottawa from white settlers, half-breeds, and Indians. Again, Ottawa ignored them. The half-breeds by now were angry and ready to take up arms, but Riel and the white settlers didn't want a rebellion. Riel believed there had to be a more peaceful way to make Ottawa realize the urgency of their requests. Dumont, however, had no faith in the federal government. He believed only an armed rebellion would give them what they asked for. He urged Riel to seize Fort Carleton and to declare a provisional government as he had done at Fort Garry in Manitoba. Finally, Riel took Dumont's advice and established a provisional government. He gave the Northwest Mounted Police at the fort an ultimatum: to surrender or they would attack. Meanwhile, Dumont had gathered together a party of armed half-breeds and Indians, and without Riel's knowledge, approached the fort. Crozier, the Northwest Mounted Police officer in charge of the fort, had sent to Regina for reinforcements when he received Riel's ultimatum. However, on seeing Dumont and his party approaching, Crozier decided, very foolishly, to take his inexperienced troops out against Dumont's skilled sharpshooters. This was the Battle of Duck Lake, a victory for the half-breeds, and was the beginning of the Riel Rebellion. The majority of white settlers didn't want violence and withdrew their support after Duck Lake. But the Treaty Indians, who were starving because of Ottawa's broken promises, supported Dumont and Riel. Poundmaker and Big Bear, chiefs renowned as warriors and respected throughout the territories, brought their warriors to join forces with the half-breeds. After Duck Lake, Ottawa hastily formed a committee to examine half-breed grievances and issued land scrips to assure the half-breeds of their land claims. But these were issued purposely to a chosen few, which caused a split within the half-breed ranks. Had the committee been formed earlier, the Battle of Duck Lake and the Riel Rebellion would never have happened. Meanwhile, Eastern troops under General Middleton were being sent to Saskatchewan. The Canadian Pacific Railway line had not been completed, and troops and supplies had to be transported on sleighs between unfinished points. Within a month, 8,000 troops, 500 Northwest Mounted Police, and white volunteers from throughout the territories, plus a Gatling gun, arrived to stop Riel, Dumont, and 150 half-breeds. The history books say that the half-breeds were defeated at Batoche in 1884. Louis Riel was hanged in November of 1885. Charge: high treason. Gabriel Dumont and a handful of men escaped to Montana. Poundmaker and Big Bear surrendered, were charged with treason, and sentenced to jail for 3 years. The other half-breeds escaped to the empty pockets of North Saskatchewan. The total cost to the federal government to stop the rebellion was $5 million. Chapter 2. My people fled to Spring River, which is 50 miles northwest of Prince Albert. Half-breed families with names like Chartrand, Isbister, Campbell, Arcand, and Vandal came here after the Riel Rebellion, where the men had been actively involved. Riel was gone now, and so were their hopes. This new land was covered with small lakes, rocky hills, and dense bush. The half-breeds who came were self-sufficient trappers and hunters. Unlike their Indian brothers, they were not prepared to settle down to an existence of continual hardship, scratching out a scanty living from the land. They were drawn to this part of Saskatchewan because the region was good for hunting and trapping, and there were no settlers. In the late 1920s, the land was thrown open for homesteading, and again came the threat of immigrants. By this time, the lakes were drying up, and the fur and game had almost disappeared. Having nowhere else to go, nearly all the families decided to take homesteads so that the land would belong to them. It was difficult to accept the fact that times were changing, but if there was to be a future for their children, the roaming, free life must be forgotten. The land was $10 for a quarter section. 10 acres had to be broken in 3 years, along with improvements, before the title would be granted. Otherwise, the land was confiscated by Land Improvement District authorities. Due to the depression and shortage of fur, there was no money to buy the implements to break the land. A few families could have scraped up the money to hire outside help, but no one would risk expensive equipment on a land so covered with rocks and muskeg. Some tried with horse and plow, but were defeated in the end. Fearless men who could brave sub-zero weather and all the dangers associated with living in the bush gave up, frustrated and discouraged. They just did not have the kind of thing inside them that makes farmers. Gradually, the homesteads were reclaimed by the authorities and offered to the immigrants. The half-breeds then became squatters on their land and were eventually run off by the new owners. One by one, they drifted back to the road lines and crown lands, where they built cabins and barns, and from then on were known as the road allowance people. So began a miserable life of poverty, which held no hope for the future. That generation of my people was completely beaten. Their fathers had failed during the rebellion to make a dream come true. They failed as farmers. Now there was nothing left. Their way of life was a part of Canada's past, and they saw no place in the world around them, for they believed they had nothing to offer. They felt shame and with shame, the loss of pride, and the strength to live each day. I hurt inside when I think of those people. You sometimes see that generation today, the crippled, bent old grandfathers and grandmothers on town and city skid rows. You find them in the bush waiting to die, or babysitting grandchildren while the parents are drunk. And there are some who, even after 100 years, continue to struggle for equality and justice for their people. The road for them is never ending and full of frustrations and heartbreak. I hurt because in my childhood I saw glimpses of a proud and happy people. I heard their laughter, saw them dance, and felt their love. A close friend of mine said, "Maria, make it a happy book. It couldn't have been so bad. We know we are guilty, so don't be too harsh." I am not bitter. I have passed that stage. I only want to say, this is what it was like, and this is what it is still like. I know that poverty is not ours alone. Your people have it too. But in those earlier days, you at least had dreams. You had a tomorrow. My parents and I never shared any aspirations for a future. I never saw my father talk back to a white man unless he was drunk. I never saw him or any of our men walk with their heads held high before white people. However, when they were drunk, they became aggressive and belligerent, and for a little while the whites would be afraid of them. Even these times were rare because often they drank too much and became pathetic, sick men crying about the past and fighting each other or going home to beat frightened wives.